Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into how people once stayed warm without fire on frozen seas, how others lived with forbidden closeness inside quiet parish houses and stone cloisters, and how travelers crossed entire continents guided only by roads of dust, memory, and shared greeting. These are small stories of endurance, carried not by kings or battles, but by ordinary people learning how to live inside cold weather, strict rules, and very long distances. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's slowly step into the past, softly, gently, together. Tonight, you begin on a wooden deck where no fire is allowed, where the air smells faintly of salt and tar, and where warmth must come from people instead of flame. Somewhere nearby, another household is keeping a quieter secret beside a parish hearth in Tudor England. And far beyond both of those places, gates of stone caravan inns are closing at sunset, while travelers from distant lands lead their animals inside and prepare to sleep beneath unfamiliar stars. These are not separate stories, not really. They belong to the same long human habit of learning how to endure whatever the world asks of you, whether that is wind, silence, or distance. And for now, you are stepping carefully onto the deck of a narrow ship before dawn, where frost already gathers along the edge of the oars. Before the sun rises, you step onto the deck. The wood beneath your boots feels slightly flexible, not weak, but alive in a quiet way, bending gently with the tide as if the ship itself is still deciding whether it belongs to the sea or the shore. Around you, the air carries the faint scent of tar rubbed carefully into the seams between planks, a smell meant to keep water out, though never entirely successfully. There is no cabin waiting ahead, no doorway, no sheltered corner where a small fire might be hidden. Instead, the ship stretches open from bow to stern, long and narrow, like a path laid across the water rather than a house built upon it. Along both sides of the hull, round shields hang in a careful line, their painted faces already touched with a thin brightness of frost. They look decorative at first, almost ceremonial, but as the wind shifts across the fjord, you begin to notice how they soften its sharpest edges. The air still moves, but it does not strike quite as hard as it would otherwise. Even before the voyage begins, the ship is already teaching you its first lesson. Warmth here will never come from walls. It will come from arrangement. Nearby, a young rower named Eric kneels beside a low wooden bench, quietly pushing dry moss into the toes of his boots. He does this slowly and without speaking, as though the task deserves attention. The moss is pale and springy between his fingers, gathered the evening before and kept tucked inside his cloak so that it would remain dry. When he stands again, he presses his heel down once against the deck to settle the padding into place. It is not elegant work, but it is reliable. Across the ship, other crew members are making similar preparations. One adjusts the fold of a wool cloak so that it can be shared later with the man beside him. Another lifts an oar and rolls his shoulders once, testing the stiffness of the morning air in his joints. You begin to understand that this voyage does not start with movement. It starts with readiness. The sky above the fjord is still the color of dim iron. Somewhere far inland, a thin line of smoke rises from a farmhouse chimney. But out here there is no such comfort. A ship like this cannot carry a hearth. Its planks are too close together, its seams sealed with tar that would soften dangerously under sparks. its balance too delicate for even a small flame, shifting unexpectedly with the waves. Archaeologists who have rebuilt ships like this in the waters near Roskilde have found the same thing again and again. Fire does not belong here. Even a single ember loose on the deck could change a voyage into something else entirely. So instead, warmth must be carried differently. The shields along the rail help. The wool cloaks help. The moss in the boots helps. And most of all, the people help each other. Eric moves now to sit beside another rower whose name you do not yet know. Without discussion, they pull one cloak loosely across both their shoulders, not because they are cold already, but because they understand they will be later. On a ship like this, preparation is simply another word for patience. As more crew members step aboard, the deck fills with quiet movement. No one speaks loudly. Voices stay low, not from fear, but from habit. Sound travels differently across water, and men who spend their lives at sea learn early that silence is another form of safety. Someone lifts a small wooden chest and slides it carefully beneath a bench near the center of the ship. It is not large, and it does not look important, but several men glance toward it as it settles into place, just to make sure it rests securely. Inside that chest, wrapped in wool and ash, a few coals from last night's fire still breathe very slowly in the dark. They will not be used here. Not on this deck. Not while the ship is moving. But they are coming with you anyway. The tide begins to turn. One by one, the crew take their places along the benches, hands resting lightly on oars that have not yet touched the water. The fjord remains quiet for a moment longer, as though waiting with them. Then, somewhere behind you, a rope loosens from its post with a soft scrape against wood. The ship shifts almost imperceptibly beneath your feet, and as it begins to move away from shore, you realize that the last true warmth you felt came not from anything you carried with you, but from the land itself. Out here, warmth will have to be made again. The shoreline fades more quickly than you expect. At first it remains close enough to see individual stones along the edge of the fjord, then only the darker band of forest behind them, and finally just a pale suggestion of land resting beneath the morning sky. The ship continues forward with a steady rhythm that feels almost gentle, though the water beneath you is already colder than anything your hands would willingly touch. It becomes clear very early in the voyage that this vessel was never meant to be warm. The deck shifts slightly each time a wave passes beneath the hull. Not dramatically, not enough to disturb your balance, but enough to remind you that the ship is not rigid. It flexes. It answers the sea instead of resisting it. The overlapping wooden planks along its sides are fastened together in a way that allows them to move just a little, like scales on the body of a fish. This movement keeps the ship fast and light and strong. It also makes fire impossible. Even a small flame would behave unpredictably here. A spark could fall between the seams. A coal could roll along the deck with the motion of the waves. The tar pressed carefully into every joint to keep seawater out would soften under heat and begin to loosen its hold. The very materials that make the ship swift would begin to betray it. So the crew never argues about whether to light a fire. They simply do not try. Modern sailors who have reconstructed ships like this in the waters near Roskilde discovered the same thing after only a few experimental voyages. Even controlled embers became difficult to manage once the deck began to shift beneath their feet. Smoke drifted low across the benches instead of rising cleanly upward. Sparks behaved like wandering insects, with no sense of direction. The safest fire, they learned, was the one that waited on shore. Eric seems to understand this without needing to think about it. He sits beside the small wooden chest you noticed earlier, his cloak drawn close around his shoulders. From time to time, he rests one hand lightly against its lid, not opening it, only checking its position as the ship moves through the water. Inside, the coals remain hidden. They are not meant to burn here. They are meant to survive the journey. Someone nearby shifts his weight and lifts one of the removable deck boards just slightly before setting it back into place. Beneath it, you catch a glimpse of stored gear and bundled rope, packed carefully in the narrow space between ribs of the ship. There is no spare room here for a hearth, no protected corner where a flame could be trusted to remain still. Everything on this vessel is designed to move. Even the benches beneath you can be lifted and adjusted when necessary. The mast itself can be lowered. The sail can disappear entirely when rowing begins. The ship changes shape depending on what the sea asks of it. Fire does not change shape. It insists on its own space, its own direction, its own attention. So instead, the crew carries something quieter. Eric finally opens the small chest for only a moment. You notice the faintest breath of warmth escape into the cold air, almost too small to be certain of. Inside, wrapped in ash and wool, a handful of charcoal still glows with a slow patience that seems older than the voyage itself. No one gathers around it. No one stretches their hands toward it. Its purpose is not to warm anyone now. It is simply to remain alive until the ship reaches land again. Among crews like this, someone is always trusted with the care of these embers. It is not a dramatic responsibility. No one announces it. But everyone understands its importance. Without those coals, lighting a new fire after landing would take longer. Meals would be delayed. Wet clothing would remain damp. Night would arrive more quickly than expected. A small glow, carried carefully, could change the comfort of an entire camp. The ship continues forward. Spray begins to reach the benches more often now, leaving a thin brightness of moisture across the wood. One of the older sailors shifts his shield slightly along the rail so that it blocks the direction of the wind more effectively. The adjustment is small, almost invisible unless you are watching closely, but the air against your cheek softens immediately. It is a reminder that warmth here depends on attention rather than convenience. No one waits for comfort to arrive on its own. Instead, they build it slowly out of position and timing and shared understanding. Somewhere ahead, the sail is raised a little higher. The cloth tightens, catching the wind with a low sound, like a deep breath being taken by something larger than the ship itself. The mast holds steady, though the deck beneath it continues its quiet movement with each passing wave. Even smoke, if it existed here, would have nowhere predictable to go. It would drift low across the benches, settle against cloaks, and vanish into the shifting air before it could rise. On a calm day, it might reveal the ship's presence across the surface of the water long before the crew wished to be seen. On a stormy one, it might scatter sparks into places no one could reach quickly enough. So the sailors carry warmth in other ways, in wool, in movement, in closeness, and in the small, breathing darkness of the ember chest beside Eric's knee. He closes the lid again carefully, pressing it down with both hands until the wood rests flat and secure. Then he leans back slightly, drawing his cloak tighter as the wind changes direction once more. Out here, even the smallest glow must learn patience. And before long, you begin to notice that the ship itself is teaching the same lesson to everyone aboard. By the time the sun lifts itself above the edge of the water, the cold has settled into the ship in a quieter way. It is no longer sharp or surprising. It has become something steady instead, like a companion that does not speak but does not leave either. Your hands grow used to the texture of damp wood beneath your fingers. Your shoulders learn the weight of wool resting across them. Even your breathing begins to match the slow rhythm of the oars dipping and rising beside you. Out here, warmth is never dramatic. It arrives slowly, and it stays close to the body. Eric sits with one knee drawn slightly upward against the bench, his hand resting again on the small wooden chest near his side. He does not open it often. There is no need. The crew already knows what lives inside it and what it means. The embers carried in that box are not meant for this moment. They belong to the next shore. Long before ships like this crossed open water, people had learned that carrying fire from one place to another was easier than creating it again from nothing. A single surviving coal, protected inside ash and wrapped in wool, could become a cooking fire within minutes once dry wood was gathered. Without that coal, the same task might take much longer, especially in wet weather when even small sparks struggled to survive. So when a voyage began, someone always brought yesterday's fire along, not as flame, as memory. The lid of the chest lifts slightly as Eric checks the embers again. Inside, the charcoal glows with a quiet red softness that seems almost too calm to belong to something so powerful. A faint breath of warmth escapes for a moment, no stronger than the warmth of your own hands pressed together. Then the lid closes once more. No one moves closer. No one stretches their fingers toward it. This is not the warmth the crew depends on today. Instead, the ember travels with them like a promise that the journey will end somewhere solid. Across the ship, one of the older sailors unwraps a strip of dried meat from a folded cloth and begins to chew slowly. He eats without hurry, watching the horizon as though measuring distance not by miles, but by time. Meals here are simple and already prepared long before the ship left shore. There is no cooking on deck, no rising smoke to follow the movement of the wind. Everything warm must wait. Still, the presence of the ember chest changes something subtle in the air around you. It reminds everyone that warmth has not been left behind entirely. It has only been folded carefully and carried forward. Experimental sailing crews who rebuilt longships in the waters near Roskilde discovered something similar while traveling in conditions close to those faced 1,000 years ago. Even when no fire could be lit aboard, the knowledge that embers waited safely inside a container changed how people felt about the coming night. It meant dry clothing could be warmed later. It meant food could be softened again. It meant light would return quickly after darkness settled across a shoreline. A small glow could shorten the distance between effort and rest. Eric adjusts his cloak as the wind shifts again. The motion is automatic now. Without looking, he angles one edge of the wool across his shoulder so that it overlaps slightly with the cloak of the man beside him. Neither of them speaks. The adjustment happens the way breathing happens, quietly and without instruction. Shared warmth is never announced. It is simply arranged. The ember chest remains still between them, its quiet heat hidden inside layers of ash that protect the coal from sudden air. Ash, in its own patient way, works almost like a blanket. It slows the breath of the fire without extinguishing it, allowing the coal to remain alive for many hours. Sometimes longer than a full day, if it is wrapped carefully enough. In this way, yesterday's fire becomes tomorrow's meal. It travels like a wrapped loaf carried from one house to another, not eaten yet, but already promised. The ship moves farther from the fjord now. where the water opens into a wider stretch of sea. Waves lift the hull a little higher than before, and the benches answer with a soft, creaking sound that rises and falls beneath the rhythm of the oars. The shields along the rail knock gently against one another as the wind changes direction again, their round edges tapping together like quiet signals passed from one end of the ship to the other. No one seems troubled by the sound. Movement like this belongs to the voyage. At the center of the ship, the ember chest shifts only slightly as the deck tilts. Eirik steadies it with his foot, then settles back again, satisfied that it will remain where it belongs. There is something comforting about knowing that warmth is still traveling with you, even when it cannot yet be used. It changes the shape of waiting. Sooner or later, the ship will reach land again. Wood will be gathered. Sparks will be coaxed gently back into flame. Cloaks will steam as dampness leaves them. The smell of smoke will return to the air in a way that feels familiar and steady and close to home. Until then, the ember rests quietly between the benches, breathing slowly beneath its covering of ash. And as the day stretches forward across the open water, you begin to understand that the crew is not only carrying fire with them, they are carrying certainty that warmth will come back. By midday, the cold has changed its character again. It is no longer something that surprises you when the wind shifts. Instead, it settles into the spaces between your shoulders and along the backs of your hands, patient and quiet, as though it has decided to travel beside you for the rest of the journey. No one aboard the ship tries to fight it directly. Instead, they arrange themselves around it. Eirik shifts closer to the rower beside him, not in a way that draws attention, but with the same practical calm that guided him earlier when he packed moss into his boots. The movement is small enough that you might not notice it at first, yet the effect is immediate. The shared edge of their cloaks now forms a thicker fold of wool between them, and the narrow space where the wind once slipped through disappears almost entirely. Warmth here is never owned by one person. It is something built together. The cloaks themselves are heavier than they first appeared when you stepped aboard. They are woven from wool thick enough to hold air inside its fibers, and that trapped air slows the escape of body heat even when sea spray dampens the surface. Modern textile studies of garments preserved from northern settlements have shown that wool like this continues to protect the body long after it becomes wet, which explains why sailors trusted it so completely. It does not keep the cold away. It keeps warmth from leaving. Across the ship, another sailor pulls a strip of animal skin higher across his shoulders, fastening it loosely at the throat with a small bone pin. The outer surface of the hide still carries a faint scent of smoke from an earlier hearth fire, a reminder that these garments were prepared slowly, carefully, and with the expectation that they would travel far from land. Fur is not worn for decoration here. It is worn because wind moves differently across it. When the ship turns slightly into the breeze, you notice how the fur shifts the air away from the sailor's neck, breaking its sharpest edge before it reaches his skin. The effect is quiet but unmistakable, like stepping behind a tree during a sudden gust. Even the boots play their part. Earlier that morning, Eirik pressed dry moss into their toes. Now, as the rowing rhythm settles into a steady pace, he flexes his feet once and then again, testing the padding beneath him. Moss holds pockets of air in the same way wool does. It softens the cold rising through the soles and slows the loss of warmth into the damp wood beneath. Sometimes straw is used in the same way. Sometimes grass gathered from summer fields and dried carefully for winter travel. None of it lasts forever, It must be replaced often. But while it remains in place, it changes the feeling of the deck beneath your feet from something sharp and draining into something merely cool and manageable. A sailor farther forward lifts one foot briefly and taps the side of his boot against the bench to settle his own padding more firmly. The motion is casual, almost absent-minded, yet it belongs to the same quiet system of survival that shapes everything else aboard the ship. No single change makes the journey warm. Many small changes make it possible. The rowing begins again after a short rest. Oars dip together, rise together, and settle once more into the slow breathing rhythm that carries the ship forward across the darker water beyond the fjord. As your shoulders begin to move with the same repeated motion, something unexpected happens. The cold that had been resting quietly along your arms starts to loosen its hold. Movement creates warmth where stillness could not. Modern reconstruction voyages have shown this clearly. Crews who remained seated without rowing lost heat quickly even when wrapped in wool, while those who continued steady physical work maintained warmth far longer. The body itself becomes part of the ship's protection, not separate from it. Eric leans forward slightly with each stroke, then settles back again, his cloak shifting with the motion like the folded wing of a resting bird. The rhythm spreads along the benches until every oar answers the same quiet signal passing through the crew. It is not hurried. It is not forced. It is simply steady. Along the rail, the shields continue their quieter work. Their round wooden faces interrupt the wind in small repeating patterns, softening the force that reaches the rower's shoulders. Seen from a distance, they look decorative, almost ceremonial. Up close, they behave more like a line of patient animals standing shoulder to shoulder against the weather, turning their broad sides toward the storm so that those behind them can rest more easily. No one speaks about this protection. It is understood. A strip of sailcloth has been tied loosely across part of the midsection of the ship now, not stretched tight enough to block the air completely, but enough to create a sense of enclosure where none existed before. The difference is mostly psychological. The wind still moves. The temperature does not change very much. Yet the presence of even a thin barrier allows the crew to feel as though they are sitting inside something rather than entirely exposed upon it. Shelter sometimes begins as an idea before it becomes a structure. Eirik draws his cloak closer once more as the light shifts across the surface of the sea. The moss inside his boots has settled firmly into place. The shared fold of wool beside him still holds its warmth. The steady motion of rowing continues to send heat quietly back through his shoulders and arms. Out here, warmth does not arrive all at once. It gathers slowly, the way animals gather together in winter fields, standing close enough that each one changes the air for the others. And as the ship moves farther into open water, you begin to understand that survival on a voyage like this depends less on fighting the cold than on learning how to live beside it. By the time the afternoon light settles across the water, something subtle begins to change aboard the ship. The cold is still present. The wind still moves across the benches. The shields along the rail continue their quiet work of softening its sharpest edges. And yet the air between the rowers feels different now. Not warmer exactly, but steadier, as though everyone aboard has begun to move inside the same rhythm. At first, the sound is almost too quiet to notice. One voice begins it. It comes from somewhere near the middle of the benches, low and even, not loud enough to carry far across the water, but strong enough to reach the rowers sitting nearest. The voice does not hurry. It does not call attention to itself. It simply repeats a short pattern of notes that rise and fall with the motion of the oars. Another voice joins, then another. Soon the sound travels the length of the ship, not as a performance, but as a shared movement that settles naturally into the work already being done. Each stroke of the oars begins to match the slow rise and fall of the song. Each breath begins to arrive at the same moment as the next. Eric listens for a while before adding his own voice. When he does, it is not to be heard clearly above the others. It is only to become part of them. Rowing songs like these are not meant to entertain anyone. They are tools as practical as the oars themselves. The steady pattern of sound keeps each movement aligned with the next, preventing sudden effort from falling unevenly along the benches. When every stroke happens together, less strength is lost to confusion, and the body spends its energy more carefully. Even more quietly, the rhythm changes something inside the crew. Breathing slows, shoulders settle, cold becomes easier to ignore. Modern sailing crews who have repeated longship voyages using reconstructed vessels have noticed the same effect. When rowers worked in silence, fatigue arrived earlier and uncertainty spread more quickly along the benches. When they moved inside a shared rhythm, the work felt shorter, even when the distance remained the same. Sound, in this way, becomes another kind of shelter. The wind continues to cross the deck, but it no longer feels as sharp against your face. Not because the air has changed, but because your attention has changed with it. The steady repetition of voices creates something like a wall you cannot see, yet somehow remain inside. A strip of sailcloth has been drawn more tightly across part of the midsection of the ship now. It hangs from a rope stretched between two upright supports, forming a narrow barrier that breaks the movement of the wind just enough to matter. No one pretends it creates true warmth. The air still carries its chill across the benches. Yet the difference is real. With even a thin piece of cloth standing between you and the open water, the ship begins to feel less like a floating platform and more like a place where people can remain together for a while. Shelter, here, is measured not by temperature but by feeling. The shields along the rail answer the wind in their own quieter language. As the ship turns slightly, their round surfaces shift the direction of the air once again. Instead of striking directly across the rower's shoulders, the breeze glides sideways along the length of the hull before lifting itself away. No one stops to adjust them now. Their work has already been done. Eric's voice grows steadier as the rhythm continues. At first he followed the pattern carefully, watching the shoulders of the rower beside him so that his breathing would match. Now the movement comes without effort. His hands rise and fall with the oar as though they have always belonged to this motion. The sound carries forward across the benches, then returns again from the stern in a slightly altered shape, as if the ship itself were answering. Somewhere near the front, one of the older sailors shifts the tone of the chant slightly lower. The change passes backward along the benches without discussion. Each voice adjusts quietly until the new pattern settles into place. The ship continues forward, but the work begins to feel lighter than before. There is warmth in this, though it cannot be measured. Shared rhythm keeps the body moving. Movement keeps the blood returning through the hands. And returning warmth makes the wind easier to bear. Even the shields seem to answer the song now. Their edges tap gently against one another as the hull moves through the waves, adding a second quieter pattern beneath the voices. Wood against wood, breath against breath, water against oar. The sounds fold together until it becomes difficult to tell where one ends and another begins. A little later, The chanting fades without ceremony. No one signals its ending. One voice simply grows quieter, then another, until the only sound left is the steady dip of the oars returning once more to their patient work. Yet something remains behind after the voices disappear. The benches feel closer. The wind feels farther away. Eric adjusts his cloak slightly across his shoulder again, though the air has not changed. The motion is small, almost unnecessary, but it carries the memory of the rhythm that has just passed through the ship. Out here, warmth sometimes arrives not as heat, but as agreement. And as the afternoon light stretches longer across the open sea, you begin to understand that even a simple human voice can change how far a journey feels. By the time the light begins to soften toward evening, the sea has changed color again. What was once pale and reflective in the morning now deepens into something darker and slower, as though the water itself has settled into the same quiet patience that fills the ship. The oars move less frequently. The sail holds more of the work now. And across the benches, the crew begins to reach for small bundles tucked beneath cloaks and gear. This is the hour of cold meals. No smoke rises from the deck. No sparks drift across the planks. Nothing sizzles or steams or warms the air around your hands. Instead, food appears already prepared, already waiting, already shaped by yesterday's fire rather than today's. Eirik unwraps a folded piece of cloth and reveals a strip of dried fish stiffened by salt and wind. He holds it carefully between his fingers for a moment before biting into it, not with hunger alone, but with the calm attention of someone who understands that this meal belongs to the journey as much as the rowing does. Around him, others do the same. Hard bread passes quietly from hand to hand. Small pieces of smoked meat are shared without ceremony. Nothing about the meal draws attention to itself. It is not meant to comfort. It is meant to continue the voyage. Food like this travels well because it has already given up its warmth. Fish preserved in salt keeps its strength for many days at sea. Meat dried slowly over earlier fires carries both nourishment and memory with it. Even bread, baked dense enough to resist the damp air, remains useful long after softer loaves would have failed. Every bite reminds you that the ship cannot cook. And yet no one seems surprised by this. Meals like these were expected long before the sail was raised. They were packed deliberately, portioned carefully, and carried with the understanding that warmth would return only when land appeared again beneath the keel. Someone passes a wooden cup along the bench. The liquid inside is darker than the water around you and carries a faint sweetness that lingers in the air even before it reaches your lips. Mead, brewed from honey and stored in small containers for travel, moves slowly from hand to hand across the crew. Each person drinks only a little before passing the cup onward again. It feels warm when it touches your throat, but the warmth does not last. Modern studies of the body in cold conditions have shown something sailors like these understood in quieter ways long ago. Drink like this can make the skin feel warmer for a short time, even while the body itself begins to lose heat more quickly beneath the surface. The comfort it offers is real, but it belongs more to feeling than to protection. Even so, no one refuses it. Out here, morale travels alongside food. Eric wipes his mouth with the back of his sleeve after taking his share, then returns the cup carefully to the rower beside him. The gesture is small and familiar. It belongs to the same rhythm that shaped the rowing earlier in the day, the same quiet agreements that keep the crew moving together without needing instruction. The shields along the rail glow faintly now, as the sun lowers itself closer to the horizon. Their painted surfaces catch the last light and hold it briefly before letting it go again. For a moment, they look less like tools of travel and more like markers placed along the edge of the ship to measure the passing of the day. Above them, the sky begins to clear. The first stars appear slowly, not all at once, but one at a time, as though they are testing the darkness before committing themselves fully to the night. Sailors like these do not need written charts to recognize them. The sky itself offers direction, distance, and reassurance in equal measure. Warmth does not come from the stars, yet their presence changes how the cold feels. Eric leans back slightly against the bench and watches the sky the same way others do. He does not speak. No one does. Silence arrives naturally at this hour, settling across the ship like another layer of wool drawn carefully over the shoulders of everyone aboard. Endurance here is not something anyone declares. It is something shared. Long before this voyage began, each sailor understood what the sea would require. Cold decks, dry meals, damp cloaks, long hours of rowing broken only by brief rests and shifting wind. None of this arrives as a surprise. It belongs to the identity of the journey itself. To travel this way is not only to move across water, it is to accept the absence of comfort as part of the work. Historians studying seasonal patterns of northern voyages have noticed that crews often chose their routes carefully to avoid the harshest winter crossings when possible. Even so, cold seas could never be avoided entirely. Ships like this depended on preparation rather than protection, and preparation meant carrying strength in quiet forms rather than expecting warmth to appear unexpectedly along the way. The ember chest still rests near the center of the ship. No one opens it now. Its glow belongs to another shore. Instead, the crew settles into the long patience of evening. Cloaks draw closer. Voices soften. The steady movement of the hull beneath your feet becomes easier to follow as the light fades from the surface of the water. Above you, the stars continue to gather, each one small, each one distant. Yet together they form a pattern strong enough to guide a ship across open darkness without needing fire at all. And as the night settles more completely around the benches and shields and folded cloaks, you begin to understand that journeys like this were never warmed by flame alone. They were warmed by people who already knew how to continue without it. Far to the south of the cold northern sea, morning begins in a different kind of quiet. There is no salt in the air here, no shields tapping against wood, no slow breathing of hidden embers carried across open water. Instead, the day begins beside a small parish hearth, where the ash has settled softly overnight, and the first faint glow of rekindled flame moves gently across the floor. You step into the room just as Margaret bends to stir the fire. She does not do this hurriedly. The movement belongs to habit rather than urgency. A small iron poker shifts the coals. A folded piece of kindling settles into place. The flame answers slowly, stretching itself upward again after the long patience of night. The warmth that fills the room is not large, but it is enough. Outside, the village still sleeps beneath a pale sky that has not yet decided whether it will become clear or gray. Inside the parish house, however, the morning has already begun. A kettle waits near the edge of the hearth. A wooden table holds yesterday's bread beneath a cloth. A pair of boots stands drying near the wall. Their leather darkened slightly from damp grass walked before sunset the evening before. Nothing here feels unusual. And yet everything here exists beside a rule that says this house should not feel like a household at all. In Tudor England, priests were expected to live without wives. The rule had been written long before Margaret was born. It belonged to older centuries, older councils, older decisions shaped partly by spiritual ideals and partly by practical concerns about land and inheritance. If priests married openly and raised children, church property might slowly pass into family hands instead of remaining where institutions believed it belonged. So the rule remained. Clergy were to live alone. Yet parish life rarely followed rules as cleanly as parchment suggested. Margaret moves quietly across the room now, lifting the kettle slightly closer to the flame. She does not pause to consider whether her presence here requires explanation. In villages like this one, everyone understands her role without speaking about it too directly. She keeps the fire, she prepares meals, she tends the small routines that allow the parish priest to move through his duties without interruption. No one calls her a wife. No one quite calls her a stranger either. Instead, people use a softer word, housekeeper. The sound of that word travels through the village like a familiar bell tone heard at a distance. Everyone recognizes it. Few examine it too closely. It allows daily life to continue without forcing anyone to ask questions that might disturb the careful balance between rule and reality. Margaret lifts a cloth from the table and checks the bread beneath it. Her hands move with quiet certainty. This is not the first morning she has stood here before sunrise. It is not the first winter she has watched smoke gather slowly along the beams above the hearth before drifting upward through the roof opening. The house answers her presence as though she belongs inside it. Outside, the church itself waits beside the narrow path that leads through the village fields. Its stone walls hold the cold longer than the wooden house does. When the priest steps inside later this morning, his footsteps will echo softly across the floor as though the building itself were listening. Churches like this shape the rhythm of village time. Bells mark the passing hours. Prayers mark the seasons. Rules mark the boundaries of expectation. Yet within those boundaries, daily life continued in ways that rarely matched official instruction perfectly. Records written by visiting church officials sometimes noted the presence of women living in parish houses. They described them carefully, often without accusation, as though the observers themselves understood that what they were seeing belonged to custom as much as to exception. In many places, communities accepted these arrangements quietly, so long as they remained modest and stable. Silence became a form of agreement. Margaret steps outside for a moment now, carrying a small bucket toward the well beside the path. The morning air touches her face with a gentler cold than the sea wind you left behind earlier. Somewhere nearby, a rooster calls once, then again, announcing the arrival of daylight more confidently than the sky itself has managed to do. When she returns, the fire has settled into a steadier glow. The parish priest will wake soon. The church door will open. Villagers will arrive with small concerns and larger hopes folded quietly into their hands. Baptisms will be prepared. Prayers will be spoken. Advice will be given beside wooden benches polished smooth by generations of use. Through all of it, the rule remains present. Clergy were meant to live without marriage, yet houses like this one existed across England, warmed each morning by fires that someone still needed to tend. Margaret places the bucket beside the hearth and pauses for a moment, listening to the faint crackle of wood as the flame settles into its work. The sound is small, almost hidden beneath the quiet of the room. Still, it carries something steady inside it. A rule can shape a life, but it cannot always describe one. And as the light grows slowly stronger beyond the doorway, You begin to notice that this house is not unusual at all. Across the country, many mornings like this one are beginning in exactly the same quiet way. The morning grows brighter slowly, the way mist lifts from a field rather than disappearing all at once. By the time the church bell rings its first clear note across the village, the parish house is already awake. Smoke has settled into the rafters in a familiar pattern. The kettle has begun its quiet work near the hearth. Bread rests beside a small knife, worn smooth from many years of use. Margaret stands near the doorway, listening. The bell does not call urgently. It does not hurry anyone. It simply reminds the village that the day has begun and that the church is open again for those who need it. Its sound travels across the hedges and low stone walls with a steadiness that belongs to places where time moves gently but persistently forward. Inside the house, her work continues as it always does. She folds a piece of linen that had been drying near the warmth of the hearth. She checks the small shelf where candles are kept ready for evening prayers. She brushes stray ash from the edge of the fireplace before stepping back to make room for the priest, who will soon pass through on his way toward the church door. Nothing about her presence here is hidden, and yet very little about it is spoken aloud. In villages across Tudor England, women like Margaret were known by the same careful word: housekeeper. The term carried enough meaning to explain their work, but not enough to define their relationship too precisely. It allowed communities to recognize what they saw each day without forcing those observations into sharper language than anyone felt comfortable using. Words like this behaved almost like light rain drifting across a field. They settled everywhere. They disturbed very little. When the parish priest enters the room, he nods to Margaret in the quiet way of someone beginning a familiar day, rather than marking an unusual meeting. He reaches for a piece of bread without needing to ask where it has been placed. She passes him a cup of warm drink, drawn from the kettle without needing instruction. Their movements belong to routine rather than ceremony. Outside, the first villagers begin to arrive along the narrow path that leads toward the church. A farmer pauses briefly beside the parish gate, adjusting the strap that holds his tools across his shoulder. A mother walks past with a child whose boots still carry traces of damp soil from the fields. No one stops to examine the arrangement inside the parish house too closely. They already understand it. Records written by traveling church visitors sometimes mention these households in careful language. They described women assisting with cooking, cleaning, and daily maintenance, noting their presence without always deciding whether it required correction. In some regions, stricter enforcement followed. In others, the arrangement remained quietly accepted, so long as it did not disturb parish life. Local custom shaped expectation, as much as written rule did. Margaret steps outside for a moment now, carrying a small basket toward the garden behind the house. The air has warmed slightly since dawn, though the grass still holds a trace of moisture along its edges. She pauses beside a row of herbs growing close to the wall and gathers a few leaves between her fingers before returning inside again. The house continues its gentle work around her. Candles are trimmed, water is carried, cloth is folded. These tasks rarely appear in official records. They leave little trace in documents or proclamations, yet they form the quiet structure that allows parish life to continue from one day to the next without interruption. Inside the church building, the priest's footsteps echo faintly across the stone floor as he prepares for morning prayers. The sound reaches the house only as a distant suggestion, softened by walls and distance. Margaret hears it anyway. She knows the rhythm of those steps well enough to recognize them without seeing them. In villages like this one, routines were shared knowledge. Everyone understood where the bread was kept. Everyone knew when the bell would ring again. Everyone recognized the place Margaret held inside the household, even when no single word fully described it. Sometimes neighbors brought small gifts to the parish house: a basket of apples after harvest, a length of cloth left quietly near the doorway, a portion of cheese wrapped carefully for later use. These gestures did not announce approval or disapproval. They simply acknowledged presence. Acceptance here moved quietly. Debates about clerical marriage had already begun in parts of Europe by this time, though their outcomes remained uncertain in England. Some voices argued that priests should be allowed to marry openly. Others believed older rules should remain unchanged. Yet inside villages like this one, daily life continued at its own pace regardless of those larger conversations. Margaret places the herbs she gathered beside the hearth and pauses again for a moment, listening as the bell rings once more across the fields. The sound travels through the open doorway, settles briefly inside the house, and fades again toward the hedges beyond. Rules shaped expectation. Custom shaped practice. And somewhere between the two, households like this one continued to exist. As the morning grows fully bright and the village path fills with quieter footsteps moving toward the church, you begin to notice that arrangements like Margaret's were not unusual interruptions in parish life at all. They were part of its weather. As the bell in the village fades into distance, another bell begins its work somewhere else entirely. Its sound travels not across hedges and gardens, but through thick stone corridors where footsteps echo more slowly and voices rarely rise above a whisper. The air here feels different from the parish house you left behind. It carries the faint scent of candle smoke and old wood, and something quieter still: the long patience of routines repeated day after day without interruption. You enter the monastery just as morning prayer is ending. The final notes of chanting settle gently against the walls before disappearing into silence again. Robes shift. Sandals move softly across worn floors. No one speaks unless necessary. Even small gestures seem shaped by the expectation that sound should travel carefully here. Life inside monasteries followed a pattern that repeated itself across the seasons. Prayer before sunrise, reading after daylight, work in gardens or workshops, prayer again. Meals taken in silence, prayer again, rest. Then the same pattern returning with the next morning bell. This rhythm shaped not only the day, but the imagination of those who lived within it. A monk passes you now in the corridor, his hands folded loosely within the sleeves of his robe. He nods once in greeting without breaking his step. His movement is measured, not slow from fatigue, but deliberate from habit. Every part of life here has already been arranged by rule long before he began to walk these halls. Rules like these were meant to create peace, and often they did. Yet silence also changes the way thoughts move. Without the ordinary interruptions of village life, the mind begins to notice its own questions more clearly. Small memories remain longer. Conversations echo more strongly. Even the sound of turning a page can feel larger than expected when nothing else follows it. In places like this, listening became a form of work. Confession was part of that work. Monks and priests were expected to hear the worries of others carefully and without judgment. Villagers arrived with concerns about family disagreements, broken promises, forgotten prayers, and moments of anger they wished to set aside. Each story required patience. Each story required attention. Over time, this listening shaped the listeners themselves. Words do not disappear simply because they have been spoken once. They remain. Records written during occasional visits by church officials sometimes described the difficulties of maintaining discipline inside monasteries, where silence lasted for many hours each day. These notes were not accusations in most cases. They were reminders that even ordered communities remained human communities, shaped by the same emotions found outside their walls. A door opens quietly at the end of the corridor. Light from a narrow window falls across a wooden desk, where a manuscript rests, waiting to be copied. The monk seated there dips his pen into ink with a motion so practiced, it barely seems to interrupt his breathing. Lines of text grow slowly across the page, one letter at a time, each stroke shaped carefully to match the one before it. Writing like this required steadiness. So did silence. Far away, in the parish house you left earlier, Margaret is moving through the evening part of her own routine. She folds cloth beside the hearth as the light fades outside the doorway. The distance between her world and this one is not large in miles, yet it feels wide in rhythm. Her work follows conversation, visitors, footsteps, and bells heard across open fields. Here, the bells echo only within stone. Both lives move forward. Both follow rules. Both leave space for quiet thoughts to grow. The monk at the desk pauses now and lifts his head slightly, listening as another bell marks the next hour of prayer. He closes the manuscript without hurry. The page will wait. It always does. Work here is never finished in a single sitting. It is carried forward slowly, like a path extended one step at a time across familiar ground. In communities like this, closeness between residents was expected to remain orderly and restrained. Yet friendships formed naturally, even inside strict routines. Shared meals, shared work, shared silence created bonds that could not always be described easily in official language. Visitors sometimes recorded concerns about attachments that seemed too strong or distractions that seemed too persistent, but these notes reflected the difficulty of separating rule from experience rather than a failure of discipline itself. Silence does not remove feeling. It makes room for it. Even the corridors seem to understand this. Their stone surfaces hold the memory of footsteps long after each one fades. Their windows admit only narrow lines of light, enough to guide movement without inviting distraction. Their walls shape sound the way careful hands shape wood, directing it gently towards stillness. The monk rises and walks toward the chapel again as the bell continues its steady call. Others follow, their robes brushing softly against one another as they pass through the doorway without speaking. Prayer begins once more, not as interruption, but as continuation. Outside the monastery walls, the evening air settles across fields and hedges and narrow village paths. Inside, the same quiet deepens, and as the last notes of chanting return again to silence, you begin to notice how a life shaped by routine can become a structure strong enough to hold even the thoughts no one speaks aloud. Later in the day, in another enclosed place not far from the monastery corridors you have just left behind, the rhythm of work continues again. This time the sound is softer. Instead of sandals crossing stone floors, you hear the small repeated motion of a needle passing through cloth. Instead of ink settling slowly onto parchment, there is thread being drawn tight across linen, stretched carefully between steady hands. The air carries the faint scent of herbs drying near a window, mixed with the quieter warmth of sunlight, resting briefly on the walls before moving away again. You are inside a convent. The enclosure here feels different from the monastery you visited earlier. The silence is not empty. It is shared. Voices speak more often, though always gently. Steps cross the courtyard in pairs rather than alone. Even the work itself seems arranged, so that no one remains separate for too long. A group of women sits together near the edge of a small enclosed garden. One trims candle wicks. Another sorts herbs gathered earlier in the morning. Two others bend over a length of cloth, their heads close enough that their sleeves brush together as they sew. Among them, one nun pauses and reaches beneath the fold of her sleeve before passing a small piece of parchment to the woman beside her. The exchange takes only a moment. No one else comments on it. Letters like these were not unusual inside convent communities. Women living together for many years developed friendships that carried the same steadiness as shared work and shared prayer. Some of these friendships appeared openly in correspondence that has survived across centuries. Others remained visible only through small references in records written by visitors who arrived occasionally to observe how the community was living. The parchment disappears between the pages of a prayer book almost as quickly as it arrived. Work continues. In houses like this one, daily routines followed a pattern that balanced devotion with practical responsibility. Gardens required care. Cloth required mending. Food required preparation. Candles required trimming before evening prayer. Each task placed women beside one another long enough for conversation to grow naturally in the spaces between silence and duty. Closeness was not unexpected here. It was part of the structure itself. Visitors sent by church authorities sometimes recorded concerns when attachments seemed to distract from communal discipline. Their notes were usually brief and cautious, written in language that suggested uncertainty rather than accusation. They described friendships that appeared unusually strong, or moments when boundaries between personal feeling and communal expectation seemed less clear than rules intended. Such observations were rare compared with the larger record of ordinary convent life, yet they remind you that enclosure never removed the need for companionship. It only reshaped it. The nun who received the folded parchment earlier now opens it again briefly while standing near the herb table. Her eyes move across the page quickly before she folds it once more and returns it to its place inside the prayer book. Nothing in her expression suggests secrecy in the dramatic sense. Instead, there is something quieter there. The same calm attention you saw earlier in Margaret as she folded linen beside the parish hearth. Lives shaped by rule still contained private spaces. Outside the garden wall, the sound of distant chanting begins again. The chapel stands only a short walk away, yet its voice arrives softened by distance and stone. One by one, the women rise from their work and begin to move toward the doorway that leads inside. Their steps are unhurried. No one speaks loudly. Routine carries them forward. Historical visitors who entered convents like this one often described communities that functioned as carefully organized households rather than isolated retreats from the world. Women supported one another through illness, shared responsibility for younger members entering the house, and maintained networks of correspondence with relatives beyond the walls. Even when enclosure limited travel, connection continued through letters and gifts carried between towns. In a few rare cases, records mention difficulties that arose when expectations of discipline were not fully maintained. These moments appear only briefly in surviving documents, often surrounded by many more descriptions of stable daily life. Their presence reminds you not of failure, but of the effort required to sustain a shared rule across many years. The women reach the chapel doorway now. Light from tall, narrow windows stretches across the stone floor as they enter. One pauses long enough to adjust the edge of another's sleeve before taking her place beside her. The gesture is small. It passes almost unnoticed, yet it carries the same meaning as the folded parchment earlier in the afternoon. Community is built from such moments. As the chanting begins again and the sound rises gently through the chapel, the courtyard outside settles into stillness. The herb table remains where it stood. The cloth waits where it was left. The needle rests quietly beside its thread. Nothing here has been interrupted. Everything continues. And as the voices inside the chapel move together in slow harmony, you begin to understand that even behind convent walls, where rules shaped each hour of the day, friendship still traveled freely between people who lived and worked and prayed beside one another for many years at a time. The change does not arrive with thunder. It arrives on paper. One morning, not long after the routines you have been watching so closely begin to feel familiar, a messenger passes along the narrow path toward the parish church, carrying a folded document sealed with wax. The journey of that document began far from this village, somewhere inside rooms where decisions were written in careful script and spoken aloud before men who believed they were reshaping the future of a kingdom. Here, however, the parchment simply waits to be opened. Margaret notices the messenger before anyone else does. She is standing beside the doorway of the parish house, brushing flour from her hands after preparing the morning bread. The sky above the fields holds the pale color of early daylight again, and for a moment, the arrival of the rider seems no more unusual than the passing of any traveler moving between neighboring towns. But when the priest steps outside to receive the folded paper, the rhythm of the morning shifts slightly. Not dramatically, only enough to be noticed. Inside the church, a little later, villagers gather in small groups along the stone floor, while the priest prepares to read what has been sent. The sound of boots against damp grass still lingers near the doorway. The bell does not ring differently. The candles burn as they always have, yet everyone senses that something larger than the village itself has reached them. The words describe new expectations. Royal authority now stands where older authority once guided decisions about church life. Monasteries across the country are being examined. Some will close. Others will change their purpose. Houses that had followed the same routines for generations will soon face uncertain futures. For many people listening inside the church, the announcement feels distant and immediate at the same time. They have never visited most of the monasteries being described, yet they understand that something familiar is shifting. Margaret stands near the back of the church while the reading continues. She does not move closer to hear more clearly. The words reach her easily enough where she stands. Around her, neighbors exchange quiet glances that carry questions no one speaks aloud yet. If monasteries close, where will their residents go? If rules change, what happens to houses like this one? The parchment offers answers slowly. Some clergy will be permitted to marry openly in the years that follow. Old expectations about household arrangements will be rewritten. Practices that once remained unspoken may soon become ordinary parts of parish life. Yet the changes do not arrive all at once. They travel across the country at the speed of messengers and memory, rather than at the speed of decision. In some villages, new customs appear quickly. In others, older habits remain long after proclamations have been read. Margaret returns to the parish house after the reading ends. The hearth is still warm. The kettle still rests where she left it earlier. Nothing inside the room has changed its position, and yet the air carries a different feeling now, as though the house itself has heard the announcement and is waiting to see what will follow. Across England, officials appointed by the Crown begin visiting religious houses to observe how they are living. Inventories are written, buildings are measured. Communities that had shaped their days around prayer and work must now decide how to continue their lives in new circumstances. Some monasteries close quietly. Others remain open under altered authority. The process takes time. It moves unevenly. Margaret places another piece of wood into the hearth and watches the flame settle around it. The movement is familiar. The sound is steady. Yet she understands, as everyone in the village does, that the rule she once lived beside has begun to change its shape. Soon, priests in some places will be able to speak openly about families that had once remained unnamed. Soon, houses like this one may no longer need careful language to describe themselves. Still, change rarely arrives as quickly as it is announced. In many villages, parish life continues much as it always has. Bread is baked, bells are rung. Advice is given beside wooden benches polished by years of use. Customs that shaped daily routines do not disappear simply because new words have been written elsewhere. Historians studying these years have often noticed how slowly reform moved once it reached the countryside. Royal policy reshaped institutions, yet communities adapted at their own pace, carrying familiar habits forward even while learning new expectations. Margaret sits beside the hearth now, listening to the small, steady sound of wood settling inside the flame. Outside, the fields look the same as they did the day before. The path toward the church still curves between hedges in the same gentle line. Nothing in the village landscape announces the change that has begun. Yet above these fields, somewhere beyond the reach of sight, the pattern of authority has shifted slightly. The way constellations seem to change their position when watched across many nights, rather than in a single evening. People continue walking the same paths beneath those stars. Only slowly do they notice that the sky itself has moved. Even after the reading of royal instructions, the village does not change all at once. The fields remain where they were. The hedges still follow the same narrow lines between pasture and path. The bell continues to ring at the same hours it always has, calling people toward prayer with a voice that sounds unchanged, even when the meaning of authority behind it has begun to shift. You return to the parish house in the evening light. When the warmth of the day has already begun to fade from the grass, Margaret is still there. She moves quietly across the room, gathering the last pieces of cloth left drying near the hearth. The fire has burned lower now, but it continues its patient work, holding just enough heat to carry the house gently into night. A letter rests beside the table where she placed it earlier, folded carefully and weighted with a small wooden spoon so that it will not curl as the air cools. Nothing about the room suggests that a kingdom has changed direction, and yet something has. Across England, monasteries that once anchored local prayer networks have closed their doors. Some buildings have become storehouses. Others have been taken into private hands. A few remain active under new arrangements, continuing their work in quieter forms than before. The change spreads unevenly, touching some regions quickly and others only after many months have passed. In villages like this one, however, daily religious life still depends on familiar gestures. Candles are lit. Doors are opened. Visitors arrive with questions that cannot be answered by proclamations alone. The priest still listens beside the same wooden benches where he listened before. Children still learn their prayers beside the same stone walls. Farmers still pause at the church gate before returning to the fields at the end of the day. Reform reshapes authority, but it does not remove the need for presence. Margaret lifts the folded letter from the table and places it carefully inside a small wooden chest near the hearth. Letters like this travel slowly between parishes now, carrying news of changes that have reached neighboring villages earlier or later than they arrived here. Some describe priests who have begun to marry openly. Others mention houses where arrangements like Margaret's have simply continued under new names. The difference is not always easy to see. Communities adapt in ways that follow their own pace. Historians studying these years often notice that clerical marriage did not suddenly transform parish life when it became more widely accepted. Instead, it formalized relationships that had already existed quietly for generations. Where once careful language allowed people to live beside rules without speaking directly about them, new expectations made those arrangements easier to acknowledge openly. Margaret pauses beside the hearth again, adjusting the position of a small iron hook that holds the kettle above the remaining coals. The movement is familiar, unchanged by any proclamation. Her work continues because the house still needs warmth. The parish still needs bread. The villagers still arrive with questions that belong to ordinary days rather than royal policy. Outside, the light lowers slowly across the fields. A pair of neighbors passes along the narrow path toward home, speaking quietly about the coming harvest. A child runs ahead of them, then returns again, then runs ahead once more. Nothing about their movement suggests uncertainty. The rhythms of village life remain steady, shaped more by seasons than by decrees. Inside the church, the evening bell begins to sound again. Its voice carries across hedges and rooftops the same way it did before reform began. Sound travels more slowly than authority sometimes, and in places like this, the bell continues to mark time with a patience that belongs to generations rather than governments. Margaret steps outside the parish house and looks toward the church door as the bell finishes its final note. For a moment, she stands still beside the path, listening as the last echoes settle into the hedges. Then she turns back toward the house and begins closing the door for the night. The movement is simple, yet it carries the weight of many evenings like this one that came before it, and many that will follow after. Across England, households that once existed quietly beside church rules now become part of a landscape learning how to name itself differently. Some priests marry openly, some communities adjust slowly, others continue as they always have, guided more by familiarity than by instruction. Change moves across the country the way animals cross a wide field at dusk. Not in a straight line, not all at once, but steadily enough that, after some time has passed, the shape of the land feels different even though each step along the way seemed small. Margaret secures the door and returns to the hearth one last time before night settles completely around the village. The coals still glow softly beneath their thin covering of ash, holding just enough warmth to carry the room into morning again. And as darkness gathers beyond the windows and the bell's echo fades across the fields, you begin to notice that even after rules changed and institutions shifted, the church remained what it had always been for most people who lived beside it, a place shaped not only by authority, but by the steady presence of human lives continuing together from one day to the next. Far beyond the hedged fields of England, where parish bells carried gently across narrow paths at dusk, another kind of evening is arriving. Here, the light fades across open ground that stretches farther than any village boundary you have seen before. The air carries the dry scent of dust instead of grass. The horizon does not end in trees or stone walls, but continues outward in long, patient lines that follow the curve of distant hills. You arrive just as the gates begin to close. Yusuf is already standing beside them. He rests one hand against the thick wooden surface of the door as the last of the caravan enters the courtyard. The camels move slowly now after many hours on the road, their steps quieter than they were earlier in the day. Small bells tied near their harness rings sound once or twice more, before settling into silence as each animal kneels beside the wall prepared for the night. The gate closes behind you with a steady weight. Inside, the world changes. Caravanserais like this one stood at regular intervals along important travel routes across Central Asia, Persia, and Anatolia. Built roughly a day's journey apart for loaded animals moving at a walking pace, they allowed merchants, pilgrims, scholars, and messengers to cross enormous distances without needing to sleep in the open. Their walls were not decorative, they were protective. Once the gate closed at sunset, no one entered and no one left until morning. The courtyard became, for a few hours each night, a place where travelers from many directions shared the same ground. Yusuf moves along the inside wall now, checking the rope lines where the animals will rest. His work is quiet and careful. Each knot is tied with the same attention you saw earlier when Eric adjusted moss inside his boots on the ship's deck. Travel, whether by sea or by land, always depends on small preparations repeated steadily. Near the center of the courtyard, a stone basin holds water drawn earlier from a well beneath the building. One by one, travelers lead their animals forward to drink. The sound of moving water spreads outward in small echoes against the surrounding walls, softening the long silence left behind by the closing gate. Lanterns begin to appear along the edges of the courtyard. Their light does not reach very far, yet it changes everything. What had been an empty space of stone and shadow only moments before becomes a place where people can see one another again after hours spent looking only at the backs of animals and the line of the road ahead. A merchant from the west loosens the strap of a travel chest beside the wall. A pilgrim removes dust from his sleeves with slow, careful movements. Two riders exchange quiet greetings in a language neither spoke earlier in the day, but both recognize now that they have arrived safely together. Caravanserais were more than resting places. They were points of meeting. Messages traveled through them. News crossed from one region to another through conversation beside lantern light. Travelers carried stories of markets, weather, distant rulers, and road conditions still waiting ahead. Even without written maps, these shared reports shaped decisions about where to go next and how quickly to move. Yusuf finishes securing the last rope and walks toward the center of the courtyard. His steps leave faint marks in the dust that settled earlier in the evening air. He pauses beside the well, lifting a wooden cup and filling it slowly before drinking. The water tastes of stone and distance. Above him, the sky has already begun to change. Stars appear earlier here than they did above the parish fields you left behind. Without trees or rooftops to interrupt the horizon, the darkness opens more widely across the desert evening. The first constellations stretch themselves across the sky like familiar markers placed along a road that continues even after daylight has ended. Some travelers watch them carefully. Others simply rest. Along the walls, small cooking fires begin to appear in designated corners of the courtyard, where flame can be used safely beneath supervision. Unlike the open deck of a longship, this enclosed space allows warmth to return again in visible form. Thin lines of smoke rise slowly into the night air before disappearing above the roofline. The smell of cooking spreads gently across the courtyard. Grain softens in small pots. Flat bread warms against stone surfaces. Tea is prepared in narrow metal vessels that glow softly in lantern light. No one hurries. Journeys across these roads required patience measured in weeks and months rather than hours. Each evening inside a caravanserai marked a small victory over distance already crossed and distance still waiting ahead. Yusuf sits beside the wall now, watching the courtyard settle into its nighttime rhythm. His work will continue later, when he checks the gate once more before sleep. For now, he listens to the voices around him as travelers describe roads behind them and roads still to come. Languages mix easily here. Gestures complete conversations when words cannot. Understanding travels without needing translation every time. As the lantern light steadies and the animals settle into quiet breathing along the walls, you begin to notice that places like this one shape the movement of entire regions without drawing attention to themselves. They stood between cities, between empires, between seasons of travel. And as the last sound of the gates closing echo fades into the desert night, you begin to understand that long before maps connected continents with lines of ink, courtyards like this one were already holding the world together in quieter ways. As the evening deepens inside the courtyard, the first cooking fires begin to settle into steadier light. What had been a place of arrival only moments ago slowly becomes a place of conversation. The animals kneel more comfortably along the walls now. The last harness bells fall silent. The dust that followed the caravan through the gate begins to sink gently back toward the ground, leaving the air clearer than it was before sunset. Lantern light moves across the stone floor in narrow, shifting circles. Voices begin to travel with it. At first, they remain separate. A trader speaks quietly beside a bundle of cloth wrapped carefully against the wall. Another kneels near a cooking pot, speaking in a different language that rises and falls in unfamiliar patterns. Two riders exchange greetings using gestures rather than words, smiling with the calm recognition of people who have met others like one another many times before along the road. Then slowly, the voices begin to overlap. Caravanserais were places where languages rested beside one another without needing to compete. Merchants arrived from cities that stood weeks apart by travel. Pilgrims followed routes shaped by memory and prayer. Messengers carried folded letters sealed in wax for rulers they would never meet again after delivery. Each traveler brought not only goods, but knowledge gathered along the way. Yusuf sits with his back against the inner wall of the courtyard, listening. He does not interrupt the conversations around him. He does not need to. Stories move easily enough without invitation. One traveler describes a river crossing farther west, where spring rains had delayed movement for several days. Another explains that a mountain pass ahead remains open later this season than expected. A third speaks about markets in a distant city where silk arrived earlier than usual this year. News like this travels quietly but quickly, sometimes faster than the caravans themselves. A man seated near the well lifts his hand to greet a traveler who has just arrived from another corner of the courtyard. They begin speaking in a shared language learned not from birth, but from travel. Around them, others follow the exchange closely, gathering pieces of information that may shape tomorrow's direction. Understanding here does not depend on everyone speaking the same words. It depends on listening carefully enough to recognize what matters. Nearby, a younger traveler unrolls a small bundle and reveals a length of dyed cloth whose color catches the lantern light in a deep red glow. He gestures toward the fabric while explaining where it was woven. Another traveler responds by pointing toward his own pack, describing a market farther east where such cloth might be exchanged for spices carried from beyond the mountains. Trade begins long before any goods are sold. It begins in conversation. Official travelers also pass through courtyards like this one. They carry letters written for rulers in cities far beyond the horizon you can see tonight. Their journeys follow roads already shaped by many generations of movement between courts. Though they speak quietly about their destinations, their presence reminds everyone listening that the road belongs not only to merchants and pilgrims, but to messages traveling between distant centers of power. Yusuf shifts slightly beside the wall, drawing his cloak closer as the night air cools. Across the courtyard, a small group gathers around a storyteller whose voice moves more slowly than the others. He speaks about a journey that followed a river for many days before reaching a city filled with bridges built from pale stone. His listeners lean closer as he describes the sound of water moving beneath those bridges and the crowds that crossed them each morning. Stories like this are not entertainment alone. They are maps carried in memory. Travelers who listened carefully could learn where roads divided, where wells could be trusted, and where storms had changed familiar paths. Even those who never intended to visit those places themselves carried the knowledge forward to others who might need it later. A cup passes from hand to hand beside the storyteller. Its warmth returns slowly to fingers that spent the day holding reins and rope. Someone adds a handful of dried herbs to a cooking pot. Another adjusts a lantern so its light falls more evenly across the courtyard wall. The night settles deeper. Languages continue to move across the space like threads drawn carefully through cloth, crossing and returning without becoming tangled. One traveler speaks in a voice shaped by Western cities near the sea. Another answers with words learned along inland routes stretching toward the steppe. A third adds a phrase from a language spoken farther south, where caravan roads meet rivers that flow toward warmer lands. No single voice fills the courtyard. Together, they form something steadier. Yusuf listens without needing to understand every word. He recognizes enough to follow the meaning that matters. The road ahead remains open. The wells remain reliable. The markets remain active. These are the details that shape tomorrow's journey. Above the courtyard walls, the stars continue their quiet movement across the night sky. Inside, conversation continues its own slower movement across the stone floor. And as the lantern light grows softer and the voices begin to settle into smaller groups preparing for sleep, you begin to understand that long before maps were drawn with careful lines across continents, places like this courtyard allowed travelers to weave distant cities together simply by speaking to one another before the gate closed for the night. Some evenings in the courtyard end with many voices still speaking long after the cooking fires grow small. Other evenings end with the quiet arrival of a single traveler. Tonight is one of those evenings. The gate has already been closed once. The animals are settled along the walls. The last of the lanterns has been adjusted so that their light falls gently across the stone floor rather than sharply against the doorway. Yusuf has just begun his final walk along the inside wall when he hears the sound of footsteps approaching from the road outside. Not hurried footsteps, not uncertain ones, simply steady. A guard near the entrance lifts a lantern and moves toward the narrow opening built beside the main gate. The traveler outside speaks only a few words before the smaller door opens and allows him to pass through. He carries little with him: a cloak, a walking staff, a small bundle tied carefully at his side. There is nothing unusual about him at first glance, yet journeys like his changed the shape of the medieval world in ways no single road could show at once. The young traveler you are watching might remind you of someone whose name would later be known across many regions. A traveler who began his journey not with a caravan of goods or a letter from a ruler, but with the intention of visiting sacred places along the pilgrimage roads that stretched from the western edge of North Africa toward cities far beyond the eastern horizon. His name was Ibn Battuta. He left his home city of Tangier while still in his early 20s, intending at first only to complete a pilgrimage to Mecca. Pilgrimage routes like these were already among the safest long-distance paths available to travelers of his time. They followed roads used for generations by people moving toward the same destination, stopping in towns and caravanserais prepared to receive them along the way. Safety did not come from walls alone. It came from recognition. Travelers greeting one another with familiar words of peace could expect doors to open more easily. In many towns along the route, mosques provided space where strangers could rest for the night, share food, and learn about the next stage of the journey from those who had already passed through earlier in the season. Hospitality traveled ahead of the traveler. Yusuf watches the newcomer step into the courtyard now and pause for a moment, while his eyes adjust to the lantern light. The young man offers a greeting that several others nearby understand immediately. One of them answers in the same words. Another gestures toward the well. A third moves aside to make space near a section of wall already warmed by a small cooking fire. No one asks many questions. The greeting is enough. Across much of the Islamic world at this time, shared customs allowed travelers like Ibn Battuta to move across enormous distances with a sense of belonging that did not depend on knowing each place in advance. Scholars welcomed scholars. Pilgrims welcomed pilgrims. Judges, teachers, and merchants recognized one another through habits shaped by learning and faith rather than by birthplace alone. A road could begin in one city and continue through many others without losing its direction. The young traveler kneels beside the well and drinks slowly. Dust from the road settles along the edge of his cloak as he rests for the first time since sunset. Around him, the courtyard resumes its quiet rhythm. Someone passes him a piece of bread. Another traveler points toward a place where he may rest before morning. Food moves easily between strangers here. Like bread passed from one hand to another, welcome does not belong to a single person for long. In his own account of his travels, written years later after he had crossed deserts, rivers, mountains, and seas, Ibn Battuta described how often he depended on hospitality, offered by people he had never met before. Teachers invited him into their homes. Judges asked him to remain in their cities for months at a time. Fellow travelers guided him along unfamiliar roads simply because they were walking in the same direction. Journeys grew longer because kindness allowed them to continue. Yusuf returns to his place beside the wall as the traveler settles among the others, preparing for sleep. The courtyard grows quieter now. Lanterns burn lower. Conversations shorten into softer exchanges meant only for those seated nearby. Yet even in this stillness, something important has begun. A journey that started with the intention of reaching one sacred city will not end there. Roads will open farther east than expected. Invitations will extend stays longer than planned. Duties will appear in places the traveler never imagined visiting when he first stepped beyond the gates of his home. Paths sometimes grow longer simply because they remain open. The stars above the courtyard shift slowly across the sky while the traveler rests beside the wall. Around him, animals breathe steadily in their sleep. Lantern light settles into deeper shadows near the gate. Yusuf makes his final round across the courtyard once more, checking the ropes and doors with the same careful attention he showed earlier in the evening. He pauses briefly when he passes the place where the traveler now lies resting. There is nothing to distinguish him from any other pilgrim beginning the road east. Not yet. But journeys like his could stretch farther than anyone listening in this courtyard tonight would easily believe. And as the lanterns fade and the night deepens across the stone walls around you, you begin to understand that sometimes the longest journeys begin not with certainty, but with a greeting spoken at the right moment beside a gate already closing for the evening. Journeys that begin with a simple intention rarely remain simple for long. The young traveler who entered the courtyard quietly the evening before continues eastward in the years that follow, crossing rivers, deserts, and mountain passes until the road itself begins to change its character. Markets grow larger, languages multiply. Invitations arrive from people whose authority stretches far beyond a single town or caravan route. Before long, the journey leads him to the city of Delhi. Delhi in those years stood at the center of a powerful court, ruled by Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, a ruler remembered both for his generosity toward scholars and for decisions that sometimes surprised even those who served beside him. Visitors arriving from distant regions often found themselves welcomed with honors that were difficult to refuse. Ibn Battuta was one of them. His reputation as a learned traveler reached the court before he fully expected it to matter. Soon he was invited to remain in Delhi, not only as a guest, but as a judge responsible for helping resolve disputes according to the legal traditions he had studied since childhood. The work was steady. Petitions arrived each morning. Arguments were presented in careful language. Decisions carried consequences that extended beyond the court itself. For a traveler who had once intended only to reach a single sacred destination, the responsibility must have felt both unexpected and strangely natural at the same time. Across the Islamic world, scholars often moved between cities where their learning allowed them to serve communities far from home. Knowledge created paths that geography alone could not. Still, service at court rarely allowed a traveler to remain entirely at ease. Life near powerful rulers followed rhythms different from those of caravan roads. Rewards could be generous. Expectations could shift quickly. Invitations could become obligations before they were fully understood. Years passed in this way. Then another journey began. The Sultan eventually asked Ibn Battuta to carry letters and gifts eastward toward China as part of a diplomatic mission. Such journeys connected distant courts through exchanges of respect rather than trade alone. Travelers chosen for these missions carried responsibility, not only for the objects they transported, but for the reputation of the rulers who entrusted them. The road turned again. Ships replaced camels. River crossings replaced desert wells. The air itself began to change. Before the mission could reach its destination, storms interrupted the voyage along the coast of India. Winds rose suddenly across the water, scattering vessels that had been traveling together only hours earlier. Waves struck the hull with a force no careful preparation could entirely prevent. In his own account, Ibn Battuta later described how the ship carrying gifts intended for the Emperor of China was lost during these storms. Chests meant to honor distant rulers disappeared beneath the sea. The carefully planned mission dissolved into uncertainty almost overnight. Journeys sometimes change direction, not because travelers choose differently, but because weather chooses for them. Far away, inside the courtyard where Yusuf still keeps watch over the gate each evening, travelers continue telling stories like this one beside lantern light. Storm stories travel easily across caravan roads. Each retelling carries both warning and reassurance. The sea may interrupt a journey, but it does not always end it. After the storm, Ibn Battuta's path carried him southward instead of east. He reached the islands now known as the Maldives, where another unexpected responsibility awaited him. The ruler there invited him to serve again as a judge, helping guide the application of religious law in a community shaped as much by ocean travel as by land routes. Island life moved differently from court life in Delhi. Palm trees replaced stone towers. Boats replaced caravans. The air carried the scent of salt instead of dust. Yet the work remained familiar. Disputes still required careful listening. Agreements still required witnesses. Decisions still shaped the daily lives of people who depended on shared understanding rather than written proclamation alone. He remained there longer than he had expected. Travelers often do. Paths lengthen when new responsibilities appear along them. Eventually, the road turned eastward again. Ships prepared once more for journeys across open water. Invitations arrived from ports farther along the coast. The destination that storms had delayed still waited beyond the horizon. Above the ocean at night, stars continued their quiet movement across the sky just as they had above desert courtyards and parish fields long before. Travelers watched them carefully, not because they controlled the journey, but because they offered direction when other guides disappeared. Routes sometimes shift like stars observed over many nights. Slowly, almost without being noticed at first. And as the lantern beside Yusuf's place along the courtyard wall burns lower toward sleep, you begin to understand that even when storms scatter ships and courts change a traveler's plans, the road itself rarely disappears. It simply opens somewhere else. Long before the journey reached its eastern edge, stories about those distant cities had already begun to circulate in courtyards, like the one where Yusuf kept watch each evening. Travelers spoke of them carefully, not with excitement alone, but with a kind of steady attention that suggested they were describing places difficult to measure using familiar comparisons. They spoke of rivers that carried boats through the center of cities rather than around their edges. They spoke of markets where goods arrived from so many directions that no single language could follow them all at once. They spoke of ships so large that their decks seemed to hold entire neighborhoods moving slowly across the water. When Ibn Battuta finally reached those eastern regions, he encountered cities shaped by systems of organization very different from those he had known before. Water moved through them in ordered channels. Bridges crossed those channels in long, repeating lines. Streets stretched outward in patterns that suggested careful planning rather than gradual growth. Even the movement of money itself followed unfamiliar paths. In many places he visited, trade depended not only on metal coins carried in small purses, but on paper notes issued by authority and accepted widely across markets. Travelers from regions where wealth traveled as silver or copper often found this practice surprising at first. Yet within these cities, paper money moved easily from one hand to another, allowing exchange to happen quickly without the weight of metal changing hands each time. The sound of those exchanges filled the streets, merchants calling out prices, customers answering with gestures and folded notes, clerks recording transactions beside tables covered with goods from distant provinces. Commerce here did not arrive quietly, it hummed. Ships resting in harbor added another layer to that sound. Some vessels rose high above the water with several decks built one above another. Their wooden structures strong enough to carry both cargo and travelers across wide seas. Compared with the smaller coastal boats he had known earlier in his journey, these ships seemed to belong to another scale of movement entirely. Travel itself changed when ships changed size. Distance felt different when more people could travel together. Markets connected more quickly when cargo moved in larger quantities at once. Even rivers behaved differently when they carried traffic this steady. Canals extended that movement farther inland. Instead of ending at the shoreline, trade continued through waterways that reached deep into the countryside, linking ports with towns that might otherwise have remained distant from maritime exchange. Boats followed these routes, the way caravans followed desert roads, stopping at stations where goods could be transferred and travelers could rest before continuing again. Cities shaped by such networks rarely depended on a single road. They depended on many. Ibn Battuta described his surprise at encountering places where administrative systems seemed to reach into everyday life with a regularity unfamiliar to him from earlier stages of his journey. Officials recorded transactions carefully. Markets followed predictable arrangements. Even travelers arriving from distant regions found themselves moving through spaces designed to guide large numbers of people without confusion. Order created its own kind of comfort. Returning travelers carried these descriptions back with them across the same caravan roads you have been following throughout this journey. In courtyards like Yusuf's, voices repeated what they had seen. They spoke of bridges built from pale stone rising above wide canals. They described streets crowded with merchants whose goods arrived from provinces farther away than most listeners could imagine traveling. They explained how paper notes could be exchanged for food, cloth, or passage without needing to weigh metal coins in the hand. Each story extended the map of the world a little farther for those who listened. Yusuf hears one of these travelers now as he sits beside the courtyard wall once more. The man gestures with both hands while describing ships whose sails rose higher than the roofs of caravanserais. Others lean closer, following each movement carefully, as though the shape of those distant harbors might become clearer if they listened long enough. Lantern light flickers across their faces as the story continues. The courtyard itself remains unchanged. Stone walls stand where they always have. The well reflects the same small circle of sky. Animals settle into the same quiet breathing along the edges of the enclosure. Yet through stories like these, the distance between this courtyard and those eastern cities becomes smaller than it once seemed. Travelers carried more than goods along these roads. They carried scale. They carried comparison. They carried new expectations about how large the world could be. Above the courtyard walls, the night remains calm. Voices soften as the conversation draws toward its end. One by one, the listeners settle into their places along the stone floor, holding in memory the shape of bridges they have never crossed and ships they have never seen. And as the lantern beside Yusuf grows dimmer toward sleep, you begin to understand that even before most people traveled to those distant cities themselves, they were already arriving there in imagination through the careful words of travelers who had returned from farther east than anyone once believed possible. By the time the lanterns begin to fade inside the courtyard, most travelers have already settled into sleep. Their cloaks rest folded beneath their heads. Their packs lean against the walls where animals breathe slowly in the dark. The cooking fires that filled the air with warmth only a short while ago have become quiet circles of ash again, holding just enough heat to last until morning. Yusuf stands beside the gate. He checks the hinges once more, the same way he has done every evening since you first arrived here. The wood answers his hand with a familiar firmness. The bar settles into place with a sound that belongs to habit rather than effort. Outside the walls, the road continues into darkness without him. Inside, the courtyard gathers itself into stillness. Places like this existed across thousands of miles of connected routes. Not identical in shape, not identical in language, but similar enough in purpose that travelers could recognize them as soon as they arrived. Built roughly a day's journey apart along many of the great land roads linking cities across Central Asia, Persia, and Anatolia, Caravanserais formed a pattern of shelter that made long-distance travel possible without requiring anyone to cross the entire landscape alone. A traveler leaving one courtyard in the morning could expect another before nightfall if weather remained steady and animals remained strong. Distance became manageable when it could be divided into evenings. Inside those courtyards, hospitality followed customs recognized across wide regions. A greeting spoken in one town carried meaning in the next. A scholar arriving from afar could expect conversation. A merchant carrying goods from distant markets could expect water for his animals and a place to rest before continuing again. Rules did not need to be written everywhere. They were remembered. Women played an important part in sustaining these networks, though their presence often appeared quietly beside the larger movements of caravans and courts. Some managed lodging spaces within towns connected to the routes. Others prepared food for travelers arriving at roadside settlements. Still others supported trade through weaving, provisioning, and maintaining the households that allowed merchants to leave home for months at a time. Movement depended on people who did not travel as much as on those who did. Above the courtyard walls, the stars shift slowly across the sky. The same sky once guided sailors like Eric across cold northern waters, where shields lined the rails of longships and wool cloaks held warmth close against the wind. The same sky stretched above parish houses, where Margaret rose before dawn to tend fires that warmed rooms shaped by rules older than the villages themselves. And now that same sky watches over roads where Yusuf closes gates each evening for travelers whose journeys connect cities most of them will never see. Different places, different customs, the same patience. For many centuries, land routes like these carried goods and knowledge across continents without needing the speed of later ships that would eventually cross open oceans more regularly. Over time, maritime travel began to carry increasing amounts of trade between distant regions, especially along sea routes linking South Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa. Yet the older roads did not disappear at once. They continued quietly beside the water. Caravans still crossed deserts. Pilgrims still followed remembered paths. Scholars still traveled between cities where students waited to learn from them. Connection rarely ends in a single moment. It changes direction. Yusuf finishes checking the gate and turns back toward the center of the courtyard. The lantern beside the well has nearly burned out now. Its light reaches only a short distance across the stone floor before dissolving into shadow. Around him, the sleeping travelers remain still, their journeys paused only until morning returns. In places like this, knowledge moved without needing maps drawn on paper. News passed from voice to voice. Letters crossed deserts carried by riders whose names were forgotten long before their messages arrived. Travelers remembered the shape of roads in their minds and passed that memory forward the same way Eric once carried a small ember across cold water, so that warmth could return later when land appeared again. Routes stretched outward like migration paths, followed by animals moving between familiar places across changing seasons. No single traveler crossed them all. No single ruler controlled them entirely. Yet together they formed a pattern strong enough to hold distant regions in quiet conversation with one another for generations. Yusuf pauses once more beside the gate before settling down to rest. Beyond the walls, the road waits for morning. Far away, parish bells will ring again across fields where Margaret begins another day beside the hearth. Still farther north, the sea continues its slow movement beneath ships where rowers once shared cloaks against the wind. And here, inside the courtyard, Travelers sleep beneath the same sky that carried them from one shelter to another without needing fire to guide them every step of the way. Across sea, parish, and desert road, people had always carried warmth with them in quieter ways,